Hi, it's Adam Jukes here. I hope you're watching this because you've already watched my previous blog on sulking. And I'm going to talk about what my thoughts on sulking eventually led me to. And I'm going to be doing this in two parts, and this is part one. The, I'm sure you know that psychotherapists and analysts spend a lot of our time working to help people understand the patterns in their lives, the way that people seem to repeat the same things over and over again. And in the profession, this is called the repetition compulsion. And it is a compulsion, clearly, and Freud recognized this in his writings about it because he was intrigued by the um, way that people constantly did the same painful things, and so that the compulsion seems to be to repeat painful or traumatic experiences, and this intrigued him, and he wrote a lot about it, and it eventually led to his thinking about the death instinct and so on, but I don't really need to go into that, although the idea of masochism is quite central in what I'm going to say. The thing is that whether you're a member of the worried well, or the well, or the disturbed, you repeat. And if you look back over your life, if you look in the rearview mirror of your life, you'll see that in relationships, and I'm going to talk about relationships in particular, but this repetition compulsion applies to anything, to the relationship with any object. An object can be a person, your job, your career, your qualifications, anything. And you know, these things are usually termed objects, but I'm going to be referring particularly to objects as people, the objects in one's life as the relationships that one has in one's life. But when we look in the rearview mirror, we see that we've done the same thing. Some people are extremely fortunate to have happy and successful lives, and I don't mean successful in terms of earning money, but simply the ability to form and maintain good attachments and to sustain them and stay with them. A great many people don't have that capacity and repeat the same painful patterns over and over again in relationships, not just romantic relationships, but in friendships and sibling relationships and so on. And it's a very intriguing question about why people would want to repeat painful experiences, because clearly it's perverse. I mean, it's the sort of ordinary perversity that most people's lives are full of. You know, well, not most people. I should wind that in a little. Let's just say the 40% of people who don't know how to maintain or have secure attachments with other people. But if you look at this repeated pattern, the extraordinary thing is that people repeat the same behavior. It's almost as if in the repetition there's some kind of belief or hope, if there's any reflecting going on at all, that this time it's going to turn out differently. And it doesn't. It turns out the way it's always turned out. And in a rather perverse way, I suppose the thinking is, well, if it's not working because I'm not doing enough of whatever it is I'm supposed to do, so often people will escalate the behavior, the repeated behavior, but with the same outcome, if not more painful than historically. Now, when I was working with sulks, this was very obvious to me. People would always do the same kind, act out the same sorts of behavior when they were sulking. And they would invariably end up with the same result: destroyed relationships, damaged relationships, whatever. And I developed something called the working hypothesis. And I used to say this to people. I used to say, look, let's just have this hypothesis that that part of you actually wants this painful outcome, that rather than it being something that you don't want, that you would do anything to avoid at all costs, let's just work with the hypothesis that actually these painful outcomes are what you want. So then we get back to the same question that Freud asked. Why do people want to repeat the same traumatic experiences and have the same traumatic endings? Well, when I used to talk with people about this, I eventually reached this understanding that people who act out these dramas, this are aiming for the same kind of pain, and the pain that they end up with, the distress, whatever it is, the traumatic experience, is generally speaking the same. And it's not that difficult to find out that this is kind of the same sort of pain that they've lived with for most of their lives. Often they'll feel it even when they're not having a drama, compulsively repeating a drama with somebody in their lives. And so I got to this point where I used to say to people, look, the only way we can think about this that's going to make any sense is with a sort of thought experiment. So let's just imagine that you want these outcomes, these painful outcomes. Now, if that's true, then we have to assume that this drama, these dramas you get into with people, the repetition compulsion, same behaviors over and over again, is actually intended to produce the outcome that you think you don't want. So that, in effect, what you're doing is, in the dramas, in the repetition, you're actually, in some incredibly skillful ways, maneuvering other people to give you what you think you don't want. Now, this was clearly true with people sulking. And then I realized, and that was my extension of the sulking theory, that this applied to lots of things, not just to sulking behavior, but to lots of other sorts of repeated dramas. And then I went a step further with people, because people kind of found that quite an interesting idea to work with. You actually do want this painful outcome. Then the question is, well, why? What do you get out of it? And then, of course, you get into the whole idea of what kind of gains there are. Gains in life often, but there are also psychological gains, and in part two, I'll go into these much more. But then I said, so what we have to assume is that you're not only responsible for what you do, you're also responsible for you. I'd say, but that's mad. You're saying I'm not only responsible for my own behavior, I'm also responsible for other people's treatment of me. And I said, well, yes, that's what I'm suggesting we think about. And they used to say, but this is mad. So eventually I came to call this the mad hypothesis. And the mad hypothesis is really very simple to state that, and in a way this, I suppose, is the outcome we aim for in psychotherapeutic treatment. And the mad hypothesis, puts at its simplest, is this: that you are responsible for everything that happens to you in your life, both internally, between your ears, and externally, the way that people relate to you. And nothing that anybody else does to you can be used to justify or excuse or in any other way explain the way you relate to them, or justify what you're doing. Well, it sounds quite mad. That's why I call it the mad hypothesis. But it's surprisingly, it sounds terribly simple, and to say it is terribly simple, but actually the underlying complexity is more than complex. It has a really serious underlying complexity. And using this with people turned out to be very effective. I mean, clearly, the work I do with people isn't obsessively pursuing the mad hypothesis, but it's kind of like the container in which I work with people. Now, so at this stage, the mad hypothesis has two objects, if you like. There's the present object. Let's say it's a romantic attachment, and he or she doesn't love me enough. Whatever those kind of standard complaints, gripes, reproaches that people get into about their partners. And I'm talking about people at the moment who are relatively worried well, but also it would apply to people who are more seriously unwell than that. So there's the which we find to be very unsatisfactory. And then there's the desired object. And this is the person that we want them to become. So what we do is we create dramas in order to get the present object to become the desired object. We want them to change to become the person that we think would make us happy, richer, more potent, whatever whatever we think the desired outcomes are. But the kicker is that actually those dramas and what we call the thinking that goes on in that space between the present object and the desired object, it's not really thinking at all. It's repeated thinking. It's ways of behaving and planning things that are going to ensure that actually we end up right back where we started with the same old reproaches, the same bad feelings, but we don't take responsibility for it. We think it's because the object is refusing to change. Now, I call those feelings, those traumatic, painful feelings, the distress, whatever it is that we experience with the present object who refuses to become the desired object, I call those default settings. So what I do and what I help people to do is to think about what these default settings are, and to think about all the things that they do and all the plans and all the things that they think they're thinking, which isn't really thinking at all. I call it stuff. And people grasp this idea quite readily. And then we start talking about separating the default stuff, because the whole point about the default settings is to find a way to explain why it is that we feel the distress that we're feeling. So if we have the drama with the present object, then we have and it turns out in the same old way, then we have a ready-to-hand explanation about why I feel the way I feel. But what people eventually begin to realize is that they always feel this way. And the dramas to get the present object to change into the desired object is actually partly to provide them with an explanation of why they feel so shitty, why we feel so shitty. Okay, that's part one. I'm going to stop there, and I hope that you've enjoyed this. I'm sorry if there's been a lot of stumbling around, but I'm doing this off the cuff, extemporizing. Okay, look back soon, because part two will be available within a couple of weeks. Thanks for watching.